Chapter 46. With the cutting and piling of the corn stalks at last completed, the overseer began assigning different blacks to a variety of tasks after the conch horn blew each dawn. One morning Kunta was given the job of snapping loose from their thick vines and piling onto a wagon, as he'd learned they called the rolling boxes, a load of large, heavy vegetables, the color of overripe mangoes, and somewhat resembling the big gourds that women in Jafur dried out and cut in half to make household bowls. The blacks here called them pumpkins. Riding with the pumpkins on the wagon to unload them at a large building called the barn, Kunta was able to see that some of the black men were sawing a big tree into thick sections and splitting them with axes and wedges into firewood that children were stacking into long rows as high as their heads. In another place, two men were hanging over thin poles the large leaves of what his nose told him was a filthy pagan tobacco. He had smelled it once before on one of the trips he had taken with his father. As he rode back and forth to the barn, he saw that just as it was done in his own village, many things were being dried for later use. Some women were collecting a thick brown sage grass, he heard them call it, and tying it into bundles. And some of the garden's vegetables were being spread out on cloths to dry. Even moss, which had been gathered by groups of children and plunged into boiling water, was being dried as well. He had no idea why. It turned his stomach to watch and listen as he passed a pen where still more swine were being butchered. Their hair, too, he noticed, was being dried and saved, probably for mortar. But the thing that really sickened him was to see the swine's bladders being removed, blown up, tied at the ends, and hung up to dry along a fence. Allah only knew for what unholy purpose. When he had finished harvesting and storing the pumpkins, Kunta was sent with several others to a grove of trees, the limbs of which they were told to shake vigorously so that the nuts growing in them would fall to the ground, where they were picked up by first Kafo children carrying baskets. Kunta picked up one of the nuts and hid it in his clothes to try later when he was alone. It wasn't bad. When the last of these tasks was done, the men were put to work repairing things that needed it. Kunta helped another man fix a fence, and the women seemed to be busy in a general cleaning of the big white house and their own huts. He saw some of them washing things, first boiling them in a large black tub, then rubbing them up and down against a wrinkled piece of tin in soapy water. He wondered why none of them knew how to wash clothing properly by beating it against rocks. Kunta noticed that the whip of the overseer seemed to strike down upon someone's back much less often than before. He felt in the atmosphere something similar to the time in Jafur when the harvest had been put safely into the storehouses. Even before the evening's conch horn would blow to announce the end of the day's work, some of the black men would begin cavorting and prancing and singing among themselves. The overseer would wheel his horse around and brandish his whip, but Kunta could tell he didn't really mean it. And soon the other men would join in, and then the women, singing words that made no sense at all to Kunta. He was so filled with disgust for all of them that he was glad when the conch horn finally signaled for them to return to their huts. In the evenings, Kunta would sit down sideways just inside the doorway of his hut, heels flat against the packed dirt floor to minimize the iron cuff's contact with his festering ankles. If there was any light breeze, he enjoyed feeling it blowing against him, and thinking about the fresh carpet of gold and crimson leaves he would find under the trees the next morning. At such times his mind would wander back to harvest season evenings in Jafur, with the mosquitoes and other insects tormenting the people as they sat around the smoky night fires and settled into long conversations that would be punctuated now and then by the distant snarling of leopards and the screaming of hyenas. One thing he didn't hear, it occurred to him, and hadn't heard since he left Africa, was the sound of drums. The Tubob probably didn't allow these black people to have any drums. That had to be the reason. But why? Was it because the Tubob knew and feared how the sound of the drums could quicken the blood of everyone in a village, until even the little children and the toothless old ones would dance wildly? Or how the rhythm of the drums would drive wrestlers to their greatest feats of strength? Or how the hypnotic beat could send warriors into a frenzy against their enemies? Or perhaps the Tubob were simply afraid to allow a form of communication they couldn't understand that could travel the distance between one farm and another. But these heathen blacks wouldn't understand drum talk any better than the Tubob. Kunta was forced to concede, though, if only with great reluctance, that these pagan blacks might not be totally irredeemable. Ignorant as they were, some of the things they did were purely African, and he could tell that they were totally unaware of it themselves. For one thing, he had heard all his life the very same sounds of exclamation, accompanied by the very same hand gestures and facial expressions. And the way these blacks moved their bodies was also identical. No less so was the way these blacks laughed when they were among themselves, with their whole bodies, just like the people of Jafur. And Kunta had been reminded of Africa in the way that black women here wore their hair tied up with strings into very tight plaits, although African women often decorated their plaits with colorful beads. And the women of this place knotted cloth pieces over their heads, although they didn't tie them correctly. Kunta saw that even some of these black men wore their hair in short plaits, too, as some men did in Africa. Kunta also saw Africa in the way that black children here were trained to treat their elders with politeness and respect. He saw it in the way that mothers carried their babies with their plump little legs straddling the mothers' bodies. He noticed even such small customs as how the older ones among these blacks would sit in the evenings rubbing their gums and teeth with the finely crushed end of a twig, which would have been lemongrass root in Jafur. And though he found it difficult to understand how they could do it here in Tubob land, Kunta had to admit that these blacks' great love of singing and dancing was unmistakably African. But what really began to soften his heart somewhat toward these strange people was the fact that over the past moon, their great showing of distaste for him had continued only when the overseer, or the massa, was around. When Kunta came by anywhere the blacks were among themselves, most of them by now would quickly nod, and he would notice their expressions of concern for the worsening condition of his left ankle. Though he always coldly ignored them and hobbled on, he would sometimes find himself later almost wishing that he had returned their nods. One night, when Kunta had fallen asleep but drifted again into wakefulness, as he often did, he lay staring up into the darkness and feeling that Allah had somehow, for some reason, willed him to be here in this place amid the lost tribe of a great black family that reached its roots back among the ancient forefathers. But unlike himself, these black ones in this place had no knowledge whatsoever of who they were and where they'd come from. Feeling around him, in some strange way, the presence of his holy man grandfather, Kunta reached out into the darkness. There was nothing to be felt, but he began speaking aloud to the Al-Quran Kairaba Kunta Kinti, imploring him to make known the purpose of his mission here if there be any. He was startled to hear the sound of his own voice. Up to this moment in the Two Bobs land, he had never uttered a sound addressed to anyone but Allah, except for those cries that had been torn from him by a lash. The next morning, as he joined the others in line for the march to work, Kunta almost caught himself saying "mornin'," as he had heard them greet each other every day. But though he knew enough Two Bob words by now not only to understand a good deal of what was said to him, but also to make himself somewhat understood as well, something made him decide to continue keeping that knowledge to himself. It occurred to Kunta that these blacks masked their true feelings for the Two Bob as carefully as he did his changing attitude toward them. He had by now many times witnessed the blacks' grinning faces turn to bitterness the instant a Two Bob turned his head away. He had seen them break their working tools on purpose, and then act totally unaware of how it happened, as the overseer bitterly cursed them for their clumsiness. And he had seen how blacks in the field, for all their show of rushing about whenever the Two Bob was nearby, were really taking twice as much time as they needed to do whatever they were doing. He was beginning to realize, too, that like the Mandinka's own secret Sierra Kango language, these blacks shared some kind of communication known only among themselves. Sometimes when they were working out in the field, Kunta's glance would catch a small, quick gesture or movement of the head, or one of them would utter some strange, brief exclamation. At unpredictable intervals another, and then another, would repeat it, always just beyond the hearing of the overseer as he rode about on his horse. And sometimes with him right there among them, they would begin singing something that told Kunta, even though he couldn't understand it, that some message was being passed, just as the women had done for the men on the big canoe. When darkness had fallen among the huts and the lamplights no longer glowed from the windows of the big house, Kunta's sharp ears would detect the swift rustlings of one or two blacks slipping away from Slave Row, and a few hours later slipping back again. He wondered where they were going and for what, and why they were crazy enough to come back. And the next morning in the fields, he would try to guess which of them had done it. Whoever it was, he thought, he just might possibly learn to trust them. 2 huts away from Kunta, the blacks would seat themselves around the small fire of the old cooking woman every evening after supper, and the sight would fill Kunta with a melancholy memory of Jafur, except that the woman here sat with the men, and some of both sexes were puffing away on pagan tobacco pipes that now and then glowed dully in the gathering darkness. Listening intently from where he sat just inside his doorway, Kunta could hear them talking over the rasping of the crickets and the distant hooting of owls in the forest. Though he couldn't understand the words, he felt the bitterness in their tone. Even in the dark, Kunta by now could picture in his mind the face of whichever black was talking. His mind had filed away the voices of each of the dozen adults, along with the name of the tribe he felt that particular one most resembled. He knew which ones among them generally acted more carefree, and which seldom even smiled, a few of them not even around the Two Bob. These evening meetings had a general pattern that Kunta had learned. The usual first talker was usually the woman who cooked in the big house. She mimicked things said by both the massa and the missus. Then he heard the big black one who had captured him imitating the overseer, and he listened with astonishment as the others all but choked, trying to stifle their laughter, lest they be heard in the big white house. But then the laughter would subside and they would sit around, talking among themselves. Kunta heard the helpless, haunted tone of some, and the anger of others, even though he grasped only a little of what they discussed. He had the feeling that they were recalling things that had happened to them earlier in their lives. Some of the women in particular would be talking and then suddenly break into tears. Finally, the talking would grow quiet as one of the women began to sing, and the others joined in. Quinta couldn't understand the words. "Nobody knows the troubles I seed," but he felt the sadness in the singing. At last there came a voice that Quinta knew was the oldest man among them, the one who sat in the rocking chair and wove things of corn shucks, and who blew the conch horn. The others would bow their heads, and he would begin speaking slowly what Quinta guessed was some kind of prayer, though it was certainly not to Allah. But Quinta remembered what was said by the old Alcala down in the big canoe. Allah knows every language. While the prayer continued, Quinta kept hearing the same odd sound exclaimed sharply by both the old man and others who kept interrupting him with it. "O Lord!" He wondered if this "O Lord" was their Allah. A few days later, the night winds began to blow with a coldness beyond any that Quinta had ever felt, and he woke up to find the last leaves stripped from the trees. As he stood shivering in line to go out to the fields, he was bewildered when the overseer directed everyone into the barn instead. Even the massa and the missus were there, and with them 4 other finely dressed Tubob who watched and cheered as the blacks were separated into 2 groups and made to face each other, and ripping off and flinging aside the whitened, dried outside shucks from the piled harvest of corn. Then the Tubob and the blacks, in 2 groups, ate and drank their fill. The old black man who prayed at night then took up some kind of musical instrument with strings running down its length. It reminded Quinta of the ancient kora from his own homeland, and began to make some very odd music on it by jerking some kind of wand back and forth across the strings. The other blacks got up and began to dance, wildly, as the watching Tubob, even the overseer, gleefully clapped and shouted from the sidelines. Their faces reddened with excitement. All the Tubob suddenly stood up, and as the blacks shrank to the side, they clapped their way out into the middle of the floor and began to dance in an awkward way, while the old man played as if he had gone mad, and the other blacks jumped up and down and clapped and screamed as if they were seeing the greatest performance of their lives. It made Quinta think of a story he had been told by his beloved old grandmother Neoboto when he was in the first Kafo. She had told how the king of a village had called together all of the musicians and commanded them to play their very best for him to dance for the people, including even the slaves. And the people were all delighted, and they left all singing loudly to the skies, and there had never been another king like him. Back in his hut later that night, reflecting upon what he had seen, it occurred to Quinta that in some strong, strange, and very deep way, the blacks and the Tubob had some need for each other, not only during the dancing in the barn, but also on many other occasions. It had seemed to him that the Tubob were at their happiest when they were close around the black ones, even when they were beating them. Chapter 47. Quinta's left ankle had become so infected that pus draining from the wound all but covered the iron cuff with a sickly yellow slickness, and his crippled limping finally caused the overseer to take a close look. Turning his head away, he told Samson to remove the cuffs. It was still painful to raise his foot, but Quinta was so thrilled to be unfettered that he hardly felt it. And that night, after the others had gone to bed and all had become still, Quinta limped outside and stole away once again. Crossing a field into the opposite direction from the one he had fled across the last time, he headed toward what he knew was a wider, deeper forest on the other side. He had reached a ravine and was clambering up the far side on his belly when he heard the first sound of a movement in the distance. He lay still with his heart pounding as he heard heavy footfalls approaching, and finally the hoarse voice of Samson cursing and shouting, "Toby! Toby!" Gripping a stout stick he had sharpened into a crude spear, Kunta felt strangely calm, almost numb, as his eyes coldly watched the bulky silhouette moving quickly this way and that in the brush at the top of the ravine. Something made him sense that Samson feared for himself if Kunta succeeded in getting away. Closer and closer he stalked, Kunta coiled tight but motionless as a stone, and then the moment came. Hurling the spear with all his might, he grunted slightly with the pain it caused, and Samson, hearing him, sprang instantly to one side. It missed him by a hair. Kunta tried to run, but the weakness of his ankles made him hardly able to keep upright, and when he whirled to fight, Samson was upon him, slamming with his greater weight behind each blow, until Kunta was driven to the earth. Hauling him back upward, Samson kept pounding, aiming only at his chest and belly, as Kunta tried to keep his body twisting as he gouged and bit and clawed. Then one massive blow sent him crashing down again, this time to stay. He couldn't even move to defend himself any further. Gasping for breath, Samson tied Kunta's wrists tightly together with a rope, and then began jerking Kunta along by its free end, back toward the farm, kicking him savagely whenever he stumbled or faltered, and cursing him every step of the way. It was all Kunta could do to keep staggering and lurching behind Samson, dizzy from pain and exhaustion, and disgust with himself. He grimly anticipated the beatings he would receive when they reached his hut. But when they finally arrived, shortly before dawn, Samson only gave him another kick or two and then left him alone lying in a heap. Kunta was so used up that he trembled, but with his teeth he began to gnash and tear at the fibers of the rope binding his wrists together, until his teeth hurt like flashes of fire. But the rope finally came apart just as the conch horn blew. Kunta lay weeping. He had failed again, and he prayed to Allah. Through the days that followed, it was as if he and Samson shared some secret pact of hatred. Kunta knew how closely he was being watched. He knew that Samson was waiting for any excuse to hurt him in a manner that the Tubab would approve. Kunta responded by going through the motions of doing whatever work he was given to do as if nothing had happened, but even faster and more efficiently than before. He had noticed how the overseer paid less attention to those who worked the hardest or did the most grinning. Kunta couldn't bring himself to grin, but with grim satisfaction he noted that the more he sweated, the less often the lash fell across his back. One evening after work, Kunta was passing near the barn when he spotted a thick iron wedge lying half concealed among some of the sawed sections of trees, where the overseer had two men splitting firewood. Glancing around quickly in all directions, and seeing no one watching, Kunta snatched up the wedge and, concealing it in his shirt, hurried to his hut. Using it to dig a hole in the hard dirt floor, he placed the wedge in the hole, packed the loose dirt back over it, then beat it down carefully with a rock until the floor looked completely undisturbed. He spent a sleepless night worrying that a wedge discovered missing might cause all of the cabins to be searched. He felt better when there was no outcry the following day, but he still wasn't sure just how he might employ the wedge to help himself escape when that time came again. What he really wanted to get his hands on was one of those long knives that the overseer would issue to a few of the men each morning. But each evening he would see the overseer demanding the knives back and counting them carefully. With one of those knives, he could cut brush to move more quickly within a forest, and if he had to, he could kill a dog or a man. One cold afternoon, almost a moon later, the sky bleak and slaty, Quinta was on his way across one of the fields to help another man repair a fence when, to his astonishment, what looked like salt began to fall from the sky, at first lightly, then more rapidly and thickly. As the salt became a flaky whiteness, he heard the black nearby exclaiming, "Snow!" and guessed that was what they called it. When he bent down to pick some of it up, it was cold to his touch, and even colder when he licked it off a finger with his tongue. It stung, and it had no taste whatever. He tried to smell it, but not only did there seem to be no odor either, it also disappeared into watery nothingness. And wherever he looked on the ground was a whitish film. But by the time he reached the other side of the field, the snow had stopped and even begun to melt away. Hiding his amazement, Quinta composed himself and nodded silently to his black partner, who was waiting by the broken fence. They set to work, Quinta helping the other man to string a kind of metal twine that he called wire. After a while they reached a place almost hidden by tall grass, and as the other man hacked some of it down with the long knife he carried, Quinta's eyes were gauging the distance between where he stood and the nearest woods. He knew that Samson was nowhere near, and the overseer was keeping watch in another field that day. Quinta worked busily to give the other man no suspicion of what was in his mind. But his breath came tensely as he stood holding the wire tight and looking down on the head of the man bent over his work. The knife had been left a few steps behind them, where the chopping of the brush had stopped. With a silent prayer to Allah, Quinta clasped his hands together, lifted them high, and brought them down across the back of the man's neck with all the violence of which his slight body was capable. The man crumpled without a sound, as if he had been pole-axed. Within a moment, Quinta had bound the man's ankles and wrists with the wire. Snatching up the long knife, Quinta suppressed the impulse to stab him. This was not the hated Samson, and went running toward the woods, bent over almost double. He felt a lightness, as if he were running in a dream, as if this weren't really happening at all. He came out of it a few moments later, when he had heard the man he left live yelling at the top of his lungs. He should have killed him, Quinta thought, furious with himself, as he tried to run yet faster. Instead of fighting his way deeply into the underbrush where he reached the woods, he skirted it this time. He knew that he had to achieve distance first, then concealment. If he got far enough fast enough, he would have time to find a good place to hide and rest before moving on under cover of the night. Quinta was prepared to live in the woods as the animals did. He had learned many things about this two-bob land by now, together with what he already knew from Africa. He would capture rabbits and other rodents with snare traps and cook them over a fire that wouldn't smoke. As he ran, he stayed in the area where the brush would conceal him, but wasn't thick enough to slow him down. By nightfall, Quinta knew that he had run a good distance, yet he kept going, crossing gullies and ravines, and for quite a way down the bed of a shallow stream. Only when it was completely dark did he allow himself to stop, hiding himself in a spot where the brush was dense, but from which he could easily run if he had to. As he lay there in the darkness, he listened carefully for the sound of dogs, but there was nothing but stillness all around him. Was it possible? Was he really going to make it this time? Just then he felt a cold fluttering on his face and reached up with his hand. Snow was falling again. Soon he was covered and surrounded by whiteness as far as he could see. Silently it fell, deeper and deeper, until Kunta began to fear he was going to be buried in it. He was already freezing. Finally, he couldn't stop himself from leaping up and running to look for better cover. He had run a good way when he stumbled and fell. He wasn't hurt, but when he looked back, he saw with horror that his feet had left a trail in the snow so deep that a blind man could follow him. He knew that there was no way he could erase the tracks, and he knew that the morning was now not far away. The only possible answer was more distance. He tried to increase his speed, but he had been running most of the night, and his breath was coming in labored gasps. The long knife had begun to feel heavy. It would cut brush, but it wouldn't melt snow. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east when he heard, far ahead of him, the faint sound of conch horns. He changed course in the next stride, but he had the sinking feeling that there was nowhere he could find to rest safely amid this blanketing whiteness. When he heard the distant baying of the dogs, a rage flooded up in him, such as he had never felt before. He ran like a hunted leopard, but the barking grew louder and louder, and finally, when he glanced back over his shoulder for the 10th time, he saw them gaining on him. The men couldn't be far behind. Then he heard a gunfire, and somehow it propelled him forward even faster than before. But the dogs caught up with him anyway. When they were but strides away, Kunta whirled and crouched down, snarling back at them. As they came lunging forward with their fangs bared, he too lunged at them, slashing open the first dog's belly with a single sideways swipe of the knife. With another blur of his arm, he hacked the blade between the eyes of the next one. Springing away, Kunta began running again, but soon he heard the men on horses crashing through the brush behind him, and he all but dove for the deeper brush where the horses couldn't go. Then there was another shot, and another, and he felt a flashing pain in his leg. Knocked down in a heap, he had staggered upright again when the two-bob shouted and fired again, and he heard the bullets thud into trees by his head. Let them kill me, thought Kunta. I will die as a man should. Then another shot hit the same leg, and it smashed him down like a giant fist. He was snarling on the ground when he saw the overseer and another two-bob coming toward him with their guns leveled, and he was about to leap up and force them to shoot him again and be done with it, but the wounds in his leg wouldn't let him rise. The other two-bob held his gun at Kunta's head as the overseer jerked off Kunta's clothing until he stood naked in the snow, the blood trickling down his leg and staining the whiteness at his feet. Cursing with each breath, the overseer knocked Kunta all but senseless with his fist. Then both of them tied him facing a large tree, with his wrists bound on the other side. The lash began cutting into the flesh across Kunta's shoulders and back, with the overseer grunting and Kunta shuddering under the force of each blow. After a while, Kunta couldn't stop himself from screaming with the pain, but the beating went on until his sagging body pressed against the tree. His shoulders and back were covered with long, half-opened bleeding welts that in some places exposed the muscles beneath. He couldn't be sure, but the next thing Kunta knew, he had the feeling he was falling. Then he felt the coldness of the snow against him, and everything went black. He came to in his hut, and along with his senses, pain returned, excruciating and enveloping. The slightest movement made him cry out in agony, and he was back in chains. But even worse, his nose informed him that his body was wrapped from feet to chin in a large cloth soaked with grease of the swine. When the old cooking woman came in with food, he tried to spit at her, but succeeded only in throwing up. He thought he saw compassion in her eyes. 2 days later, he was awakened early in the morning by the sounds of festivities. He heard black people outside the big house shouting, "Christmas gift, massa," and he wondered what they could possibly have to celebrate. He wanted to die so that his soul could join the ancestors. He wanted to be done forever with misery unending in this two-bob land, so stifling and stinking that he couldn't draw a clean breath in it. He boiled with fury that instead of beating him like a man, the two-bob had stripped him naked. When he became well, he would take revenge, and he would escape again, or he would die. Chapter 48. When Kunta finally emerged from his hut, again with both of his ankles shackled, most of the other blacks avoided him, rolling their eyes in fear of being near him, and moving quickly elsewhere, as if he were a wild animal of some kind. Only the old cooking woman and the old man who blew the conch horn would look at him directly. Samson was nowhere to be seen. Kunta had no idea where he had gone, but Kunta was glad. Then, a few days later, he saw the hated black one bearing the unhealed marks of a lash. He was gladder still. But at the slightest excuse, the lash of the two-bob's overseer fell once again on Kunta's back as well. He knew every day that he was being watched as he went through the motions of his work, like the others moving more quickly when the two-bob came anywhere near, then slowing down as they left. Unspeaking, Kunta did whatever he was ordered to do, and when the day was over, he carried his melancholy deep within himself, from the fields back to the dingy little hut where he slept. In his loneliness, Kunta began talking to himself, most often in imaginary conversations with his family. He would talk to them mostly in his mind, but sometimes aloud. "Fa," he would say, "these black ones are not like us. Their bones, their blood, their sinews, their hands, their feet are not their own. They live and breathe not for themselves, but for the two-bob. Nor do they own anything at all, not even their own children. They are fed and nursed and bred for others. Mother," he would say, "these women wear cloths upon their heads, but they do not know how to tie them. There is little that they cook that does not contain the meat or the greases of the filthy swine. And many of them have lain down with the two-bob, for I see their children who are cursed with the Sasoboro half-color." And he would talk with his brothers, Lamin, Suwadu, and Madi, telling them that even the wisest of the elders could never really adequately impress upon them the importance of realizing that the most vicious of the forest animals was not half as dangerous as the two-bob. And so the moons passed in this way, and soon the spikes of ice had fallen and melted into water. And before long after that, green grass came peeping through the dark reddish earth. The trees began to show their buds, and the birds were singing once again. And then came the plowing of the fields and the planting of the endless rows. Finally, the sun's rays upon the soil made it so hot that Kunta was obliged to step quickly, and if he had to stop, to keep his feet moving to prevent them from blistering. Kunta had bided his time and minded his own business, waiting for his keepers to grow careless and take their eyes off him once again. But he had the feeling that even the other blacks were still keeping an eye on him, even when the overseer and the other two-bob weren't around. He had to find some way not to be so closely watched. Perhaps he could take advantage of the fact that the two-bob didn't look at blacks as people, but as things. Since the two-bob's reactions to these black things seemed to depend on how those things acted, he decided to act as inconspicuous as possible. Though it made him despise himself, Kunta forced himself to start behaving the way the other blacks did whenever the two Bob came anywhere near. Hard as he tried, he couldn't bring himself to grin and shuffle, but he made an effort to appear cooperative, if not friendly, and he made a great show of looking busy. He had also learned a good many more two Bob words by now, always keenly listening to everything that was said around him, either out in the fields or around the huts at night, and though he still chose not to speak himself, he began to make it clear that he could understand. Cotton, one of the main crops on the farm, grew quickly here in the two Bob's land. Soon its flowers had turned into hard green bowls and split open, each filled with fluffy balls, until the fields as far as Kunta could see were vast seas of whiteness, dwarfing the fields he had seen around Jafur. It was time to harvest, and the wake-up horn began blowing earlier in the morning. It seemed to Kunta, and the whip of the overseer was cracking in warning even before the slaves, as they were called, could tumble from their beds. By watching others out in the field, Kunta soon learned that a hunched position made his long canvas sack seem to drag less heavily behind him as the endlessly repeated handfuls of cotton from the bowl slowly filled his sack. Then he would drag it to be emptied in the wagon that waited at the end of the rows. Kunta filled his sack twice a day, which was about average, although there were some, hated and envied by the others for bending their backs so hard to please the two Bob, and succeeding at it, who could pick cotton so fast that their hands seemed to blur. By the time the horn blew at dusk, their sacks would have been filled and emptied into the wagon at least 3 times. When each cotton wagon was filled, it was taken to a storehouse on the farm, but Kunta noticed that the overflowing wagons of tobacco harvested in the larger fields adjoining his were driven away somewhere down the road. 4 days passed before it returned empty, just in time to pass another loaded wagon on its way out. Kunta also began seeing other loaded tobacco wagons, doubtlessly from other farms, rolling along the main road in the distance, drawn sometimes by as many as 4 mules. Kunta didn't know where the wagons were going, but he knew they went a long way, for he had seen the utter exhaustion of Samson and other drivers when they had returned from one of their trips. Perhaps they would go far enough to take him to freedom. Kunta found it hard to get through the next several days in his excitement with this tremendous idea. He ruled out quickly any effort to hide on one of this farm's wagons. There would be no time without someone's eyes too near for him to slip unnoticed into a load of tobacco. It must be a wagon moving along the big road from some other farm. Using the pretext of going to the outhouse late that night, Kunta made sure that no one was about, then went to a place where he could see the road in the moonlight. Sure enough, the tobacco wagons were traveling at night. He could see the flickering lights each wagon carried, until finally those small specks of brightness would disappear in the distance. He planned and schemed every minute, no details of the local tobacco wagons escaping his notice. Picking in the fields, his hands fairly flew. He even made himself grin if the overseer rode anywhere near. And all of the time he was thinking how he would be able to leap onto the rear end of a loaded, rolling wagon at night and burrow under the tobacco without being heard by the drivers up front because of the bumping wagon's noise, and unseen not only because of the darkness, but also because of the tall mound of leaves between the drivers and the rear of the wagon. It filled him with revulsion even to think of having to touch and smell the pagan plant he had managed to stay away from all his life. But if that was the only way to get away, He felt sure that Allah would forgive him. Chapter 49. Waiting one evening soon afterward behind the outhouse, as the slaves called the hut where they went to relieve themselves, Kunta killed with a rock one of the rabbits that abounded in the woods nearby. Carefully he sliced it thinly and dried it as he had learned in manhood training, for he would need to take some nourishment along with him. Then, with a smooth rock, he honed the rested and bent knife blade. He honed and rested the bent knife blade he had found and straightened, and wired it into a wooden handle that he had carved. But even more important than the food and the knife was the safi he had made, a cock's feather to attract the spirits, a horse's hair for strength, a bird's wishbone for success, all tightly wrapped and sewn within a small square of gunny sacking with a needle he had made from a thorn. He realized the foolishness of wishing that his safi might be blessed by a holy man, but any safi was better than no safi at all. He hadn't slept all night, but far from being tired, it was all Kunta could do not to burst with excitement, to keep from showing any emotion at all, throughout the next day's working in the fields. For tonight would be the night. Back in his hut after the evening meal, his hands trembled as he pushed into his pocket the knife and the dried slices of rabbit, then tied his safi tightly around his upper right arm. He could hardly stand hearing the familiar early night routine of the other blacks, for each moment, which seemed to be taking forever to pass, might bring some unexpected occurrence that could ruin his plan. But the bone-weary field hands' mournful singing and praying soon ended. To let them get safely asleep, Kunta waited as much longer as he dared. Then, grasping his homemade knife, he eased out into the dark night. Sensing no one about, he bent low and ran as fast as he could go, plunging after a while into a small, thick growth of brush just below where the big road curved. He huddled down, breathing hard. Suppose no more wagons were coming tonight? The thought lanced through him. And then a nearly paralyzing, worse fear. Suppose the driver's helper sits as a rear lookout? But he had to take the chance. He heard a wagon coming minutes before he saw its flickering light. Teeth clenched, muscles quivering, Kunta felt ready to collapse. The wagon seemed barely crawling, but finally it was directly across from him and slowly passing. 2 dim figures sat on its front seat. Feeling like screaming, he lunged from the growth of brush. Trotting low behind the squeaking, lurching wagon, Kunta awaited the road's next rough spot. Then his outstretched hand clawed over the tailboard, and he was vaulting upward, over the top and into the mountain of tobacco. He was on board. Frantically, he went burrowing in. The leaves were packed together far more tightly than he had expected, but at last his body was concealed. Even after pawing open an air space to breathe more freely, the stench of the filthy weed almost made him sick. He had to keep moving his back and shoulders a bit this way or that, trying to get comfortable under the pressing weight. But finally he found the right position, and the rocking motion of the wagon, cushioned by the leaves, which were very warm around him, soon made him drowsy. A loud bump brought him awake with a sickening start, and he began to think about being discovered. Where was the wagon going, and how long would it take to get there? And when it arrived, would he be able to slip away unseen, or would he find himself trailed and trapped again? Why had he not thought of this before? A picture flashed into his mind of the dogs and Samson and the 2 Bob with their guns, and Kunta shuddered. Considering what they did to him last time, he knew that this time his life would depend upon not getting caught. But the more he thought of it, the stronger his urge grew to leave the wagon now. With his hands, he parted the leaves enough to poke his head out. Out in the moonlight were endless fields and countryside. He couldn't jump out now. The moon was bright enough to help his pursuers as much as it could help him. And the longer he rode, the less likely it was that the dogs could ever track him. He covered up the hole and tried to calm himself, but every time the wagon lurched, he feared that it was going to stop, and his heart would nearly leap from his chest. Much later, when he opened the hole again and saw that it was nearing dawn, Kunta made up his mind. He had to leave the wagon right now, before he came any closer to the enemy of open daylight. Praying to Allah, he grasped the handle of his knife and began to wriggle out of his hole. When his entire body was free, he waited again for the wagon to lurch. It seemed to take an eternity, but when it finally did, he made a light leap, and he was on the road. A moment later, he was out of sight in the bushes. Kunta swung in a wide arc to avoid two bob farms where he could see the familiar big house with the small, dark huts nearby. The sounds of their wake-up horns floated across the still air to his ears, and as the dawn brightened, he was slashing through underbrush deeper and deeper into what he knew was a wide expanse of forest. It was cool in the dense woods, and the dew that sprinkled onto him felt good, and he swung his knife as if it were weightless, grunting in his pleasure with each swing. During the early afternoon, he happened upon a small stream of clear water tippling over mossy rocks, and frogs jumped in alarm as he stopped to drink from it with his cupped hands. Looking around and feeling safe enough to rest for a while, he sat down on the bank and reached into his pocket. Taking out a piece of the dried rabbit and swashing it around in the stream, he put it in his mouth and chewed. The earth was springy and soft beneath him, and the only sounds he could hear were made by the toads and the insects and the birds. He listened to them as he ate, and watched sunlight stippling the leafy boughs above him with splashes of gold among the green. And he told himself that he was glad he didn't have to run as hard or as steadily as he had before, for exhaustion had made him an easy prey. On and on he ran for the rest of the afternoon, and after pausing for his sundown prayer, he went on still farther until darkness and weariness forced him to stop for the night. Lying on his bed of leaves and grass, he decided that later he would build himself a shelter of forked sticks with a roof of grass, as he had learned in manhood training. Sleep claimed him quickly, but several times during the night he was awakened by mosquitoes, and he heard the snarlings of wild animals in the distance as they made their kills. Up with the first rays of the sun, Kunta quickly sharpened his knife and then was off again. A while later he came upon what was clearly a trail where a number of men had walked. Although he could see that it had not been used in a long time, he ran back into the woods as fast as he could go. Deeper and deeper into the forest, his knife kept slashing. Several times he saw snakes, but on the 2-bob farm he had learned that they would not attack unless they were frightened or cornered, so he let them slither away. Now and then he would imagine that he heard a dog barking somewhere, and he would shiver, for more than men he feared dogs' noses. Several times during the day, Kunta got into foliage so dense that in some places even his knife wasn't stout enough to clear a path, and he had to return and find another way. Twice he stopped to sharpen his knife, which seemed to be getting dull more and more often. But when it didn't work any better afterward, he suspected that the constant slashing at briars, bushes, and vines had begun to sap his strength. So he paused to rest again, ate some more rabbit, and some wild blackberries, and drank water that he found in cupped leaves of plants at the bases of the trees. That night he rested by another stream, plunging into sleep the moment he lay down, deaf to the cries of animals and night birds, insensible even to the buzzing and biting of the insects that were drawn to his sweaty body. It wasn't until the next morning that Kunta began to think about where he was going. He hadn't let himself think of it before, since he couldn't know where he was going because he didn't have any idea where he was. He decided that his only course was to avoid nearness to any other human beings, black or Tubob, and to keep running toward the sunrise. The maps of Africa he'd seen as a boy showed the big water to the west, so he knew that eventually he'd reach it if he kept moving east. But when he thought about what might happen then, even if he wasn't caught, of how he would ever be able to cross the water, even if he had a boat, of how he would ever get safely to the other side, even if he knew the way, he began to get deeply frightened. Between prayers, he fingered the Safi charm on his arm, even as he ran. That night, as he lay hidden beneath a bush, he found himself thinking of the Mandinka's greatest hero, the warrior Sundiata, who had been a crippled slave so meanly treated by his African master that he had escaped and gone hiding in the swamps, where he found and organized other escaped ones into a conquering army that carved out the vast Mandinka Empire. Maybe, Kunta thought, as he set out again on this fourth day, he could find other escaped Africans, somehow here in the land of Tubob, and maybe they would be as desperate as he was to feel their toes once again in the dust of their native land. Maybe enough of them together could build or steal a big canoe, and then Kunta's reverie was interrupted by a terrible sound. He stopped in his tracks. No, it was impossible. But there was no mistake. It was the baying of hounds. Wildly he went hacking at the brush, stumbling and falling and scrambling up again. Soon he was so tired that when he fell again, he just sat there, very still, clutching the handle of his knife and listening. But he heard nothing now, nothing but the sounds of the birds and the insects. Had he really heard the dogs? The thought tormented him. He didn't know which was his worst enemy, the Tubob or his own imagination. He couldn't afford to assume that he hadn't really heard them, so he started running again. The only safety was to keep moving, but soon, exhausted not only by having to race so far and so fast, but also by fear itself, he had to rest again. He would close his eyes for just a moment and then get going again. He awoke in a sweat, sitting bolt upright. It was pitch dark. He had slept the day away. Shaking his head, he was trying to figure out what had wakened him when suddenly he heard it again, the baying of dogs. This time much closer than before. He sprang up and away so frantically that it was several moments before it flashed upon his mind that he had forgotten his long knife. He dashed back where he had lain, but the springy vines were a maze, and though he knew, maddeningly, that he had to be within arm's length of it, no amount of groping and scrabbling enabled him to lay his hand on it. As the baying grew steadily louder, his stomach began to churn. If he didn't find it, he knew he would get captured again, or worse. With his hands jerking around everywhere underfoot, he finally grabbed hold of a rock about the size of his fist. With a desperate cry, he snatched it up and bolted into the deep brush. All that night, like one possessed, he ran deeper and deeper into the forest, tripping, falling, tangling his feet in vines, stopping only for moments to catch his breath. But the hounds kept gaining on him, closer and closer, and finally, soon after dawn, he could see them over his shoulder. It was like a nightmare repeating itself. He couldn't run any farther. Turning and crouching in a little clearing with his back against a tree, he was ready for them, right hand clutching a stout limb he had snapped off another tree while he was running at top speed, left hand holding the rock in a grip of death. The dogs began to lunge toward Kunta, but with a hideous cry he lashed the club at them so ferociously that they retreated and cowered just beyond its range, barking and slavering, until the two Tubob appeared on their horses. Kunta had never seen these men before. The younger one drew a gun, but the older one waved him back as he got down off his horse and walked toward Kunta. He was calmly uncoiling a long black whip. Kunta stood there wild-eyed, his body shaking, his brain flashing a memory of Tubob faces in the wood grove, on the big canoe, in the prison, in the place where he had been sold, on the heathen farm, in the woods where he had been caught, beaten, lashed, and shot 3 times before. As the Tubob's arm reared backward with the lash, Kunta's arm whipped forward with a viciousness that sent him falling sideways as his fingers released the rock. He heard the Tubob shout, then a bullet cracked past his ear, and the dogs were upon him. As he rolled over and over on the ground, ripping at the dogs, Kunta glimpsed one Tubob's face with blood running down it. Kunta was snarling like a wild animal when they called off the dogs and approached him with their guns drawn. He knew from their faces that he would die now, and he didn't care. One lunged forward and grabbed him while the other clubbed with the gun, but it took all of their strength to hold him, for he was writhing, fighting, moaning, shrieking in both Arabic and Mandinka, until they clubbed him again. Wrestling him violently toward a tree, they tore the clothes off him and tied him tightly to it around the middle of his body. He steeled himself to be beaten to death, but then the bleeding Tubob halted abruptly, and a strange look came onto his face, almost a smile, and he spoke briefly, hoarsely to the younger one. The younger one grinned and nodded, then went back to his horse and unlashed a short-handled hunting axe that had been stowed against the saddle. He chopped a rotting tree trunk away from its roots and pulled it over next to Kunta. Standing before him, the bleeding one began making gestures. He pointed to Kunta's genitals, then to the hunting knife in his belt. Then he pointed to Kunta's foot, and then to the axe in his hand. When Kunta understood, he howled and kicked, and was clubbed again. Deep in his marrow, a voice shouted that a man, to be a man, must have sons. And Kunta's hands flew down to cover his photo. The two Tubob were wickedly grinning. One pushed the trunk under Kunta's right foot, as the other tied the foot to the trunk so tightly that all of Kunta's raging couldn't free it. The bleeding Tubob picked up the axe. Kunta was screaming and thrashing as the axe flashed up, then down so fast, severing skin, tendons, muscles, bone, that Kunta heard the axe thud into the trunk as the shock of it sent the agony deep into his brain. As the explosion of pain bolted through him, Kunta's upper body spasmed forward and his hands went flailing downward as if to save the front half of his foot, which was falling forward, as bright red blood jetted from the stump as he plunged into blackness.